There are concerns about national security and a U.S. military flight crew that was forced to make an emergency landing during a surveillance flight along China's southern coast.
April 1st, 2001, a U.S. Navy EP-3 surveillance aircraft is flying over the South China Sea in international airspace, 70 miles southeast of Hainan Island. Two Chinese fighter jets intercepted J-8 finbacks from the People's Liberation Army Navy. One of the Chinese pilots, Lieutenant Commander Wang Wei, approaches the EP-3 three times.
He's very close.
Yes.
He's almost probably 20 feet from our wingtip. So
And on the third pass, he flies too close and gets pulled into one of the spy plane's propellers. The J-8 is sliced in half. Wang Wei ejects but is never found. The damaged EP-3 makes an emergency landing on Chinese territory. Its 24 crew members are detained for 11 days, triggering an international incident. This is the Shenyang J-8 finback, China's attempt to build its first indigenous fighter jet. With over 300 built, they served for decades, constantly upgraded to stay relevant against more modern fighters. The J-8's most famous moment came during that collision with the EP-3 in 2001, an incident that highlighted both the aircraft's limitations and China's determination to defend its own airspace. This is the story of the J-8, China's first homegrown jet fighter, and the aircraft that never quite caught up. By the late 1950s, China's Air Force was flying Soviet-designed aircraft, MiG-15s, MiG-17s, and newer MiG-21s. Some were imported directly from the Soviet Union, others were licensed built in China, but they were all Soviet designs. Chinese aircraft designers wanted to create something truly indigenous, a fighter designed and built entirely in China. In the early 1960s, Western countries began developing strategic bombers and reconnaissance aircraft capable of flying at high altitudes and high speeds. The MiG-21 variants China was operating lacked the speed, altitude, range, and radar capability needed to intercept these new threats. China needed a high-performance interceptor. In 1964, the 6th Academy of the Ministry of National Defense began evaluating requirements for a new fighter. The specifications were demanding: maximum speed of Mach 2.2, service ceiling above 20,000 meters, sea level climb rate of 200 meters per second, and a combat radius of 750 to 1,000 kilometers. The fighter needed to intercept American aircraft like the Convair B-58 Hustler bomber and the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief. Two design institutes submitted proposals. The Chengdu Aircraft Design Institute proposed a single-engine, turbofan-powered fighter with a canard delta layout, the J-9. The Shenyang Aircraft Design Institute proposed something simpler, a twin-engine turbojet version of the J-7, which was itself a Chinese copy of the MiG-21. They called it the J-8. The J-8 concept won. It offered lower technical risk and could be developed faster using existing technology. The J-9 program continued separately, but was eventually cancelled in 1980. Elements of that design would later evolve into the Chengdu J-10 decades later. The People's Liberation Army approved the J-8's operational requirements on May 17, 1965. Huang Jiqian became chief designer, with Zhu Songfen as vice chief designer. The J-8's design was straightforward. Take the basic MiG-21/J-7 layout and scale it up to accommodate two engines instead of one. The results look similar to Soviet experimental aircraft like the Je-152 and the Sukhoi Su-15, with side-mounted air intakes, a cone-shaped nose, and low-mounted delta wings. Design work was completed in September 1965. The Shenyang Aircraft Factory was expected to have a prototype flying by the end of 1966. Then the Chinese Cultural Revolution began. The political turmoil devastated the J-8 program. Huang Jiqian, the chief designer, was killed in an air crash in May 1965 and replaced by Wang Nangshu. The Shenyang Aircraft Factory's chief engineer also died, and his successor was dismissed in November 1966 during the Cultural Revolution's early purges. Development was transferred to a joint J-8 development command led by Wang Jin, but progress slowed to a crawl. The construction of 2 prototypes was done almost clandestinely to avoid drawing attention during the political chaos. The first prototype, designated 001 Red, was built from August 1967 to June 1968. On December 19, 1968, 001 Red was damaged during high-speed taxiing test. It wasn't until July 5, 1969 that the J-8 made its first successful flight with test pilot Jin Juhuan at the controls. Shortly afterward, the program stalled again when the Flight Test Command and Shenyang's Chief Design Office were disbanded during continued political turmoil. The J-8 program had started in 1964, and it wouldn't enter service for another 11 years. The J-8 finally entered service on March 2, 1980, and by that time, it was already recognized as obsolete. The aircraft's basic configuration resembled an enlarged MiG-21 with 2 Liang WP-7A turbojet engines. It could reach Mach 2.2 and had better range and altitude performance than the J-7, but its avionics were outdated and it lacked an effective radar system. The initial production J-8, later designated J-8A, was primarily a day fighter. Production numbers were extremely limited because the aircraft simply wasn't good enough for its intended role. Development of an improved version, the J-8-1, began in February 1978, even before the original J-8 had officially entered service. The J-8-1 replaced a radar rangefinder with the SR-4 radar and added the capability to fire the PL-4 air-to-air missile. The guns were upgraded from Type 30-1 30mm cannons to Type 23-3 23mm cannons based on the Soviet GSH-23. The first J-8-1 prototype was completed in May 1980 and destroyed on June 25th during its first engine run when a ruptured hydraulic line caused a fire in the engine bay, and the entire hydraulic system had to be reworked. China realized the J-8 design needed more than incremental improvements. In 1982, development began on a substantially redesigned version, the J-8-2. The J-8-2 moved the air intakes from the nose to the sides of the fuselage, allowing installation of proper nose-mounted radar. This fundamental redesign gave the aircraft a completely different appearance and significantly improved its combat capabilities. The first J-8-2 prototype flew on June 12, 1984, but even this improved version had limitations. Chinese avionics technology lagged far behind Western standards. The radar was domestic but flawed, and the weapon systems were basic. Then came an unexpected opportunity. In the early 1980s, US-China relations thawed. The United States recognized that a stronger China could serve as a counterbalance to the Soviet Union. American companies were permitted to sell weapons and technology to China with State Department approval. Grumman Corporation was brought in to upgrade the J-8-2 with F-16 avionics under a program called Peace Pearl. The plan was to fit Chinese J-8-2s with American radar, weapon systems, and navigation equipment, transforming them into a genuinely modern fighter. 2 J-8-2 airframes were sent to the United States for modification. Grumman began installing Western avionics. An export version, designated F-8-2, was even displayed at the 1989 Paris Air Show, loaded with Chinese weapons to demonstrate what a fully upgraded version would look like. Then on June 4, 1989, Chinese tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square. The brutal crackdown on pro-democracy protesters triggered immediate sanctions from the United States and the European Union. Arms embargoes were enacted, and the Peace Pearl program was officially canceled in May 1990. The 2 unfinished J-8-2 airframes in the United States were returned to China, and China was on its own once again. The J-8-2 would have to rely on domestic and Russian technology instead. Without American technology, China continued developing the J-8-2s using whatever it could obtain. Various upgraded versions emerged through the 1990s and 2000s. The J-8D added in-flight refueling capability. A modified J-8-2 with a fixed refueling probe first flew on November 21, 1990. The aircraft entered service in 1996 and made its public debut on October 1st, 1999 during a flypast in Beijing celebrating the 50th anniversary of the People's Republic. The refueling probe was mounted on the starboard side of the cockpit, but early versions had a problem. The probe created excessive noise at high speeds that disrupted the pilot. The design was later modified to reduce the noise. Other variants added improved radars, new weapon systems, and upgraded engines. China also partnered with Russia on the J-8-2M, which featured Russian Phasotron Zhuk radar and avionics. The aircraft was marketed for export but saw limited success. The final fighter variant, the J-8F, first flew in 2000. It featured a modern glass cockpit with a heads-up display, improved Type 1493 radar, and compatibility with advanced Chinese air-to-air missiles, including the PL-12 active radar homing missile. Despite all these upgrades, the J-8 remained fundamentally limited by its basic 1960s airframe design. It was trouble-prone, maintenance-intensive, and its performance couldn't match modern 4th-generation fighters like the F-16 or F-18. At best, analysts compared the J-8-2 series to early 1960s versions of the American F-4 Phantom, a fighter that had already been retired by most Western air forces. The J-8 served primarily because China didn't have better options in sufficient numbers. It filled gaps in China's air defense network, while more capable indigenous designs like the J-10 and J-11 were developed. But the J-8 did have one advantage. It was there, in service, flying patrols, and in 2001, that put it in position for an incident that would become the aircraft's most famous moment. April 1st, 2001, around 9 a.m. local time. A U.S. Navy EP-3E signals intelligence aircraft is conducting a routine reconnaissance mission over the South China Sea. The crew of 24 is 5 hours into what would typically be a 10-hour mission. The EP-3 is flying at 22,500 feet, about 70 miles southeast of Hainan Island, in international airspace. The aircraft is monitoring Chinese communications and radar emissions, the kind of intelligence gathering the U.S. routinely conducted near China. Two People's Liberation Army Navy J-8-2 interceptors are scrambled from Lingshui Air Base on Hainan Island. The fighters are piloted by Lieutenant Commander Wang Wei and his wingman, Zhao Zhu. This wasn't unusual. Chinese fighter jets regularly intercepted American surveillance aircraft in the region. The U.S. flew about 200 reconnaissance missions per year near China, and J-8s frequently shadowed them. Wang Wei was known for aggressive intercepts. He had a reputation for flying close to American aircraft, sometimes dangerously close. The two J-8s appeared about a mile away from the EP-3, and the American crew initiated an early turnaround, preparing to head back to base. Standard procedure when intercepted. Wang Wei approached from the rear left and stopped about 10 feet away from the EP-3's wing. According to American crew members, he saluted them, then dropped back about 100 feet. Then he approached a second time, this time stopping just 5 feet away. He appeared to mouth off something to the American crew before falling back again. On his third approach, Wang Wei got too close. His J-8 was pulled into the slipstream of the much larger, slower EP-3 and struck one of the surveillance aircraft's propellers. The collision was catastrophic. The J-8 was sliced in half. Wang Wei was seen ejecting, but his parachute apparently didn't open properly or opened too late, and his body was never recovered. He was 33 years old. Shrapnel from the destroyed J-8 tore through the EP-3. The nose cone was completely severed, the left outer propeller was badly damaged, one engine failed, and the aircraft rolled inverted and dropped 14,000 feet, vibrating violently. Lieutenant Shane Osborne, the EP-3's pilot, wrestled with the controls. The aircraft had lost critical flight instruments, no airspeed indicator, no altimeter. The plane was coming apart and barely controllable. Osborne considered ditching into the ocean, but realized they might not survive. The alternative was landing at Lingshui Air Base on Hainan Island, Chinese territory, without permission. For the next 20 minutes, the EP-3 crew frantically tried to destroy classified material. They hadn't been properly trained for emergency destruction procedures. They stomped on laptops, poured hot coffee over hard drives, tore documents with their hands. Osborne issued Mayday calls, no response from Chinese authorities. He issued more Mayday calls, at least 15 distress signals, selecting the emergency transponder code, still no acknowledgement. With no other option, Osborne brought the crippled aircraft in for an unauthorized emergency landing at Langshui Air Base. The EP-3 touched down at 170 knots with no flaps, no trim, a damaged elevator, and weighing 108,000 pounds. Osborne used full right aileron throughout the landing to compensate for the damaged left side. The aircraft landed about 10 minutes after Wang Wei's wingman had already landed at the same base. Chinese military trucks and soldiers carrying AK-47s were waiting. The American crew was detained. For 11 days, they were held on Hainan Island and regularly interrogated, though none revealed classified information. Chinese authorities stripped the EP-3 of its intelligence equipment and classified materials, equipment the crew had failed to fully destroy during their emergency descent. Diplomatic negotiations were tense. China demanded an apology, and the United States refused, citing that they were flying in international airspace, but they also needed to secure the crew's release. U.S. Ambassador Joseph Proher, working with Secretary of State Colin Powell, crafted what became known as the Letter of Two Sorries. The United States expressed regret and sorrow for the death of Wang Wei and for entering Chinese airspace without permission to make the emergency landing, but stopped short of an official apology or admission of fault for the collision. On April 11, 2001, the crew was released and flew to Guam on a commercial airliner. The EP-3, however, remained on Hainan. China refused to allow it to be flown off the island. Lockheed Martin technicians had to disassemble the aircraft, which was then flown back to the United States in two Antonov AN-124 transfer planes in July of 2001. The aircraft was eventually repaired and returned to service, flying missions until 2020. Lieutenant Shane Osborne received the Distinguished Flying Cross for saving his crew and aircraft. In China, Wang Wei was posthumously honored as the guardian of territorial airspace and waters, and declared a revolutionary martyr. His widow received a personal letter of condolences from President George W. Bush. The Hainan Island incident became a major point of tension in US-China relations and highlighted the risk of aerial intercepts in disputed areas. China continued upgrading the J-8 throughout the 2000s. The final combat variant, the J-8F, entered service in the mid-2000s with improved radar and compatibility with more advanced missiles. Some reconnaissance variants continued to be produced even after fighter production ended. But the J-8's days as a frontline fighter were numbered. China was producing more capable, indigenous designs like the J-10 and J-11, and later the J-20 stealth fighter. These aircraft made the J-8 obsolete in every meaningful way. The last combat variants of the J-8 were scheduled for retirement by June 2022, with only specialized reconnaissance variants remaining in limited service. Over its production run from 1979 to the mid-2000s, approximately 300 J-8s in various versions were built. The aircraft served China's Air Force and naval aviation for over 40 years, constantly upgraded, however never quite good enough, but filling a gap until better options became available. The Shenyang J-8 Finback was China's first attempt at designing an indigenous fighter jet, with development beginning in 1964 with ambitious goals. The reality, however, fell short. The Cultural Revolution delayed development by years, and by the time the J-8 entered service, it was already obsolete. However, I wouldn't call it a failure. The J-8 succeeded at something more important than being a great fighter. It was China's first step toward building its own advanced military aircraft, and the experience gained designing, building, and upgrading the J-8 contributed to later, more successful programs. The J-8 served for over 40 years, not because it was exceptional, but because it was there. China's homegrown fighter doing what it could do while better designs were being developed. A bridge between copying Soviet aircraft and creating truly modern indigenous fighters. And if you look at the Chinese Air Force today, it's not exactly an obsolete force, is it? Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.